Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're learning about a platform called ServiceNow. You might have heard me briefly mention it in some previous videos, but today we're going to go more in depth because I found a way for you guys to try the platform and get a feel for it for free. Now, what we're going to do in this particular video is just use a simple IAM access request as our example. But ultimately, the real goal is just to get familiar with how it handles requests, approvals, tasks, and records. So let's just get into it, right? Now, to start, we're going to look at what we're using this lab to understand. Okay. In this example, basically Maya Patel needs access to the sales reporting portal. What we're going to do is walk through that request from both sides, what the user sees when they submit it and what the analyst or technician sees when they're working it. The goal is not to just build a form, okay? It's to understand how ServiceNow takes a user request and moves it through the kind of workflow that analysts deal with every day. So as we're going through this, pay attention to how the request starts, how it becomes work for someone else, and how ServiceNow keeps track of what happened. However, before we build it, let's talk about why that kind of workflow and this kind of setup matters. All right. Okay. So workflow matters because access work is basically just rarely one technical action. Okay. Usually before someone gets access, the request has to be reviewed, assigned, completed, and documented. Now, ServiceNow is often the place where this happens. Okay. So even though this example is just, about IAM, the same idea applies to a lot of workplace requests that are done in the technical field because there's different departments of your technical team. You have your cybersecurity, your IAM, you have your general service desk, but all of these people will use this same platform in order not to just communicate to each other, but to send access requests across departments because sometimes you'll start on something and you'll think it's one thing, but then you'll get to a point where like you resolve your part, but you understand, hey, this actually needs to go to someone else. Well, now you can actually assign it to that person and be able to do things that way. But now that we've kind of talked a little bit about why the platform matters, let's look at what you need to follow along. All right. The nice part about this lab is that everything we are using is free. So the only thing you're going to need today is your laptop, a browser, and access to ServiceNow's free developer environment. You do not need a paid license or a company setup. You also do not need to connect this to Okta, Intra, or Active Directory to work. The point of all of this is to keep this beginner friendly and focused on learning how the platform actually operates. So the first real step into getting all this is setting up your ServiceNow instance. So let's talk a little bit about that. All right. To build anything in ServiceNow, you need a place to work. Obviously, that is where the personal developer instance or PDI comes in. Basically, a PDI is your free ServiceNow sandbox. It lets you practice inside the platform without touching a real company environment. What you'll do with these instructions is basically create a free account on the ServiceNow developer site, request your instance, and then wait for it to finish setting up. Once it's ready, you're going to save your instance information somewhere safe and also make sure that you log in regularly because after 10 days of inactivity, the instance can be reclaimed. So I would just stay on top of that to make sure that if you're continuously working on this or trying to build it up a little bit, that you're getting, all of that information. Now, once your instance is open, the next step is just getting comfortable with where things are. So let's talk a little bit about that. Now, when you first open Service now, it's going to feel like a lot, okay? So don't worry about learning the whole platform or every aspect and feature all at once, okay? For this lab, we are just focusing only on the needed areas that are going to help us create this request and automate what happens after it's submitted, and maybe review the records that ServiceNow kind of created along the way for the ticket. Now, think of this ultimately here, all of this as your map, okay? It shows the places we will keep coming back to while we are building and testing the workflow. So now that we know where the major pieces are and all of the things that we're kind of expecting, we can start setting up the people that are going to be involved in this project. So let's go ahead. Now, before we build the form itself, we need the people involved in the process first, okay? That's just how all of this stuff is set up. Maya is basically going to be the person asking for access, okay? And her manager is going to be the one to approve it, and the IAM fulfillment team is where the task will go after approval. Now, this gives a simple way to practice how ServiceNow uses user requests, manager relationships, and assignment groups to kind of move to the right place. If you think these instructions are too ambiguous or you are not seeing something here that lines up, because I pretty much did the buttons as exactly as they are. But if you need like a more visual thing, at the very back of this presentation is the ServiceNow manual. So you can go through there and look through all of that, and it'll show you the visual aspect of clicking through everything, if that's what you need. But now that we have people and our groups exist and we've kind of done all of this, we can build the actual form that Maya is going to use. So let's do that. Now, the form Maya uses is what we like to call in ServiceNow a catalog item. Basically, a catalog item is a request form inside ServiceNow. In this lab, we're just creating one for application access. The important thing to understand is that catalog items are basically just how a user turns something that they need into something trackable that the IT team can kind of interact with and do for them. So basically, instead of sending a very vague Teams or Slack message asking for assistance, they can actually do this standardized thing where they'll show you what's happening, give you screenshots, or anything that you might add to the form to request information from them. Now, the form is only useful if it asks the right questions, right? So let's start talking about variables. Now, catalog variables are just the questions that are on the form, okay? For example, instead of letting someone type, I need access with no context, we can ask for a business reason. That gives us the approver and analyst something basically useful to review. Now, the other fields on this work basically the same way. They collect the context ServiceNow needs to make the request easier to understand, route, document, and report on. So now that the form can collect the right information, we need to tell ServiceNow what to do after someone submits it. That is where Flow Designer comes in. Okay. Flow Designer is ServiceNow's way of building automation without having to actually write code. In this lab, the flow starts when the catalog item is submitted. And then from there, it handles the approval and creates the task for the fulfillment team if the request is actually approved. Now, once the flow is saved, activated, and connected to the catalog item, the form and the automation are going to work together. So now that we can test the workflow, let's test it like a real user. What we're going to do is test it from the user side. As I said, Maya is going to submit the form asking for standard access to the sales reporting portal so that she can review the weekly sales reports. After she submits it, ServiceNow is going to create a record that tracks the request and then starts the flow that we just built. This is where you can see the difference between a simple form and a real workflow. The user is just going to submit one request, and then behind the scenes, ServiceNow is going to create the structure that's needed to move that request forward. So now that the request exists, the next step is approving it and completing the assigned work. Now, when a request is submitted, most of the time, not always, it has to be approved in some way, shape, or form. And once it's approved, basically what ServiceNow does is create the task or a task for the IAM fulfillment team. So since this lab is not actually connected to a real identity platform, we can kind of simulate the technical work with a work note. Now that note should explain what the analyst would have done in the real system, like granting access to the sales reporting portal. After that, the task can be closed complete. Once the task is closed, we can go back and look at what ServiceNow recorded. So we now review the records ServiceNow kept, right? So this is one of the most important parts of lab because ServiceNow does not just move the work forward, it also keeps track of your work. So you can see what was requested, who approved it, who worked on it, what they documented, and when it was closed. That kind of record matters when people need, to troubleshoot an issue, review access, or prove that a process was particularly followed. So now that you have seen the full workflow, let's connect this lab back to our real career skills and kind of talk a little bit about that. All right. So this lab is useful because it shows the kind of workflow that people touch in real jobs. Even if your role is not specifically ServiceNow admin, or you might not specifically work with ServiceNow, you might still work with tasks, approvals, and documentation history. Okay. So for IAM, help desk, compliance, and platform admin work, understanding how these requests move through a system like this helps you kind of sound more practical and less theoretical when you're walking into those interviews. So even though this is a small lab, it still gives you a pretty decent amount of hands-on exposure to the workflow that's going to show up in a lot of these places that you're going to work in the future if you are currently job hunting or if you're currently in the market. But before we wrap up, I wanted to show you the list of resources that I included so you can kind of piece all of this together yourself and learn in a more organic way. All right. LabKit is one. Now you see like the developer website, the docs, and all of this stuff. Basically, these are KBs. They're going to help you understand how all of this stuff works and how to interact with it. If you ever get confused or there's something in here that's just not answering your questions, try to look it up for yourself. But if that doesn't work, please post a question here. I'm more than happy to answer it. In fact, I'd rather you DM me so it doesn't blow up the video because I'd rather people, interact and be able to get their answers in a more long form format, especially when it comes to stuff like this, because if something's going wrong, I'm going to need to look at it. But ServiceNow changes between releases as well. So my version of ServiceNow might be different than the instance that you get. So the docs are really just there as the backup if something moves. Okay. Now let's get close with the main point of the lab and kind of talk a little bit about everything. Okay. There we go. Main takeaway, all right? So, main takeaway is that ServiceNow is more than just a ticketing tool. Okay, in this lab, you used an IAM request to see how the platform handles forms, approvals, task documentation, and record history. The access request is just the example. Okay, the real skill is understanding how ServiceNow moves and works from a user, from the user to technician end to end. Okay, and what I want you guys to do now is seriously build it, test it, and practice explaining what each part does. Because the more that you explain and the more that you dig into, the better that you're going to be at understanding it. So, like and follow, share with your friends. I hope you guys have a great week and peace out.